So just to deal with it, we've got UCISA's answer to David Dimbleby, Adrian Ellison from the University of West London.
Thanks very much, Dave. Wow. Okay, so I hope we can get some lively debate. As Dave says, we want some audience participation. And we've got an hour. I'm going to keep you to time. And I want us to try and move as quickly as we can so we can get through as many of your questions as we can. But before we get involved in that, let me introduce you to your panelists this afternoon. So on my far right, your left, we have Paula Vickers, Director of IT at Middlesex University. We're delighted to welcome Gift Ozonuwe, who is a student from Wolverhampton University. We have Chris Blenkhorn, a solutions architect at the Cisco Educational Research Team. And on my nearest to me, we have Thomas Connor, Senior Lecturer in Bioinformatics from Cardiff University, who you may have heard speak this morning. So welcome, panelists. Thank you very much. And without further ado, we're going to move straight to our first question, which this afternoon comes from Mike Donnelly in York. Mike Donnelly, please. Can we get a mic to Mike, please?
Hello. Do you think you'd ever build another data center?
Ooh, now there's a good question. Paula, will we ever build another data center?
Absolutely never. That has been the position since 2002, Middlesex University. So we had a hosted data center in 2002. Then in 2009, we retendered that contract and still went for a hosted data center. And this year we have done the same and still going for a hosted data center. I don't see any value to the business in managing data centers. I think suppliers can do that perfectly well on our behalf.
And maybe before I invite some questions from the audience and some comments, the supplier perspective, Chris, do you want to comment on that? Will we build another data center?
Well, I don't agree entirely. I think individual organisations need to focus on aspects of their business rather than necessarily building IT resources such as physical assets, such as data centres. And clearly, data centres will be built, but it will be the province of the service providers, the cloud providers, whether they be operating in the colo mode or infrastructure as a service, platform as a service. That's to be decided by the business requirements of the institution. And in terms of an institution, indeed any organisation investing heavily in data centre resources, I think that's largely a thing of the past.
Okay. What does our audience think? Do you agree? Are data centres a thing of the past? Sure, and absolutely.
Very much on the same point that you raised, Paula. It's why we just need to redeploy our staff to do things that they're good at. All right, we can never do the same level of IT that an ISP can give us. We can't provide that same level of service, so why bother?
Okay. There was a comment over on my right-hand side of the room. Someone had their hand up. It's Peter.
I take the point about external companies not being able to being able to do it rather better and more effectively than we do. That's not always a message that's heard by senior management. So, given it's such a no-brainer, and I'm aware of some institutions that have built data centres, in some cases 2 data centres on the same campus for resilience, given that they've still got that attitude, how do we sell it to our senior management?
That's a very good question. Paula, you've obviously managed to solve this problem at Middlesex. Do you want to comment on that?
The reason we ended up with a hosted data center is because they took our space away. So essentially they offered me a wet basement and I was able to persuade them that actually that really wasn't a cost-efficient place to build a new data centre in. So therefore the argument was really easy. They wanted the space. You know, we lost the campus, but they also didn't want to give me any more space. I think most universities now recognise that space is a premium. They also recognise that increasingly services need to be 24/7. And therefore, if space is a premium and you can't get the right space to build the right sort of data centre, but also actually they're looking for 24/7 and they're not willing to give you the staff to man that data centre 24/7, then I think you can make some reasonably cogent arguments around that to persuade senior management. I have seen other universities still invest in data centres. It completely puzzles me. I think largely because they haven't really recognised what the total cost of ownership of that thing is. And I think that there's still a fear in the sector of letting go of certain things. But genuinely, my executives are more than happy to trust us with our server infrastructure or our system assets without feeling the need to own them. So, I mean, I'll talk more about it tomorrow actually, because it actually forms part of the presentation I want to give tomorrow. But I think there are good reasons why we shouldn't do it.
Not really a response to Paula, but just a general question. How many of us do know the total cost of ownership of our data centres?
Well, that speaks volumes. I think that we've got another question that I think will help us develop this topic actually, because we're talking about possibly not building new data centres ourselves, but around how can we make best value of the data centres that we do have. And our next question comes from Jim Florence from Robert Gordon University. Jim.
Some of the questions have already been answered, but we have built 2 data centres in the last probably just over 12 months. One of them was forced upon us because we had to move out of the building in 6 months to 8 months, and we had to build something quickly, and we couldn't get anything up where we are. It was so cool. Would you consider a data centre sharing with someone to try and reduce cost, and or do you see the benefits or disadvantages of that?
Okay, thanks, Jim. Thomas, I'm going to look to you because you've sort of gone into the cloud and looked at a shared model already. What do you think about sharing services, perhaps sharing a data centre?
Sharing in what sense? I mean, I guess there's 2 aspects to it. So, I mean, I know a lot of people in the room are, I guess, IT services people. And I guess there is a distinction. So what we found at Cardiff is the majority of our server estate isn't associated with the universities that are teaching or IT services. It's actually associated with research. So the majority of our servers are actually research related. So I mean, I think the first thing is it's actually, I think, important to distinguish between the two because you know, it might be that university executive is happy to co-locate servers or put them out somewhere else. An academic who's writing a grant might not be so happy. And certainly in terms of how you fund that with overheads and with research councils, there are questions over how you'd actually handle that. But in terms of sharing services, I mean, I guess, so what I'm sort of getting at is that at the moment we already share data centres with the IT services. And I guess in principle it would be perfectly fine. You know, I wouldn't have a problem with sharing either in a colo or on the site. I guess the main question for us is around security. Because I'm a biomedical researcher. I handle data routinely which is sensitive, and I handle data routinely which could be patient identifiable. And so in terms of how we handle that, we have an infrastructure set up to enable us to handle that securely. And of course the thing is, as soon as you start mixing services or mixing systems on your network, you start opening up security. And so it's a question of how you balance the security requirements of things with the possible savings you can get from sharing.
Paula?
that they have gone into an arrangement with another university to share space in a commercial data centre, and they manage that space. And that's a fine model. They still have to do all of the management of the data centre in a way, or these are the systems in a way that I would choose not to. But that does protect, does give you the protection you just described for such a secret. But I actually don't see there being any problem in doing that with a commercial partner rather than an HE partner, because my worry is if I do it with another HE partner, when there's a fire, will they give the same attention to my servers as they would to their servers? I want a commercial SLA. I don't want to be doing best endeavours in a data centre. That's actually one of the reasons I went there. So I don't see that you get any more protection by working with other HE partners in a data centre than you would a commercial partner. There are various contract terms that you can assist on, and you can look for suppliers to have the relevant ISO accreditation. What I have seen, though, with the research bids that have come into our university lately is that the research councils are asking me, have I got the right ISO accreditations? Have I got the right sorts of internal policies? Now, frankly, my suppliers have got it, okay? But my institution, my IT service, doesn't have those ISO accreditations. So actually, I look on paper worse than they do. And the problem is, for me, I can't inherit what my supplier's doing. So what I have to do is show an end-to-end ISO accreditation. So the onus is on me in this new world to get all of the ISO accreditations to the same level as my commercial partner has got, so I can show an end-to-end protection of the data to satisfy the research councils. I don't see those research councils saying, I'm feeling a little bit worried it's in a commercial provider's data centre. They actually want to see the accreditations, and as long as you've got them, all your partners got them, they are happy with that.
Okay, so there's a challenge for us as a sector. Can we compete with the commercial world in terms of standards and availability? And I'm conscious that I know some of you in the room have been down the data center outsourcing route, have worked with a shared environment, and in fact even won some UCISA awards in the process. So I'm going to throw this one over to you, the audience. Any comments on that? Can we run services in the data center as a shared service in the sector? Well, what I'm thinking is if we're sharing a data center that's within the sector, so it's within an institution, and we're offering that as a shared service, can we offer that shared service in a way that is sustainable for other institutions to use?
That wasn't quite the question I was going to answer. JISC has, over the past couple of years, been working with some of the institutions in London to procure a shared data centre from a commercial provider. And I don't know how many people here are aware of that. And they're now sort of repeating that for a second shared data centre in the north of England. So, you know, that and I at the LSE, when we come to when our on-site data centre reaches end of life, I'm certain that we don't have any intention of replacing that. We will find another either shared facility or an outsourced location.
So that, in a sense, is a compromise between the shared service world and the commercial sort of backing of a supplier.
Just to add to that, we're in conversation at the moment about our second data centre in the north of England. And there's a lot of interest from the northern universities to create an environment where we can actually host our infrastructure. At the same time, and contrary to the points just raised by the panel, we're actually building a new data centre at Liverpool, principally around our research, because of some of the very large research activities that we're currently undertaking, but also to host some of our business systems, which have got a significant amount of life left in them. So I do see a value in retaining an on-site facility, particularly around the research and bringing a lot of our researchers in because of the type of research we're involved in and the need to have that within our environment. I fully support the arguments I hear elsewhere and in different circumstances, I think I've been driven in different directions. But at this point in time, I do see the value of what we're doing around our data centre. And it's not just about the data centre, it's more about a centre of competence for high-performance computing and other activities, which fits with the institutional strategy, and I think that's an important factor.
So I'd like to share a perspective on this. I work as part of Cisco's education and research team, but we're within a broader public sector team, so we have colleagues who work in police, local government, and central government. And there's absolutely no doubt about it. The different shared services models are much more prevalent elsewhere, and that includes police forces and central government where there is actually assured data to be protected. So those models are much more prevalent elsewhere. And it's interesting to me because on the whole those organisations are quite insular in many ways. You know, that they do their own thing, whereas within HE there's definitely a community and a lot of peer relationships. And it's a little bit of a surprise to me that different shared services models, including sharing on-site resources as well as doing colo provider type projects, that they aren't more prevalent. So I'd be interested to understand from the audience. I can ask you a question. You know, why do you not think that has happened? Because it's a trend elsewhere.
So the Liverpool scenario is a good example. So Liverpool's a university that runs a genetic sequencing hub. They produce huge amounts of data on site. And we're talking about, you know, they've got a set of instruments which produce 10 terabytes of data every 10 days. And we do that forever. And that has to go somewhere. It has to be processed somewhere. And so actually, when you're talking about going to commercial data centres, which maybe some distance from universities, people straight up, things like that, which are intrinsically harder to get connected up to those instruments, actually, you've got a showstopper in terms of delivering a service which the university's having to do. And so, I think in terms of one of the reasons why there's such a difference in the models is because, unlike other sectors where perhaps there's more similarity between what, say, police forces do, the variability in research and in IT activities across universities is huge. And so you pick the right solution to your requirements as an institution. I think that's the core difference.
Yeah, I think it's important to recognise that it is what suits the institution, and I don't have a preference for either. I can see the value in both approaches. I wonder how long it will be before universities are actually working more closely with FE colleges and schools, and actually infrastructure becomes an environment which we can share in a way perhaps we've never thought of previously. And if that does happen, I think both models will probably be prevalent in the sector. But I can see there's if you take the GIST model, you could extend that very easily to encompass further education, the FE and the colleges, as well as schools moving down the line. So I just see there as an opportunity in the future for that to happen. And just a final point, I think where we're seeing some of the GISC activities, particularly in the south, is driven by other factors in London, I believe, in terms of what created them to do that. So I think there will always be those situations, a trigger that says that actually this model is now the relevant one to have. And some of it may be your current environment infrastructure has come to end of life. It's a great time to really consider whether moving out of an on-premise environment to a location out of a colo or a third-party provider.
Okay, I thought we've got a comment over there.
Thank you. I'll just make a general point that up until now it's been reasonably possible to have a fair estimate of how many racks you would be needing going forward. But I think that equation is a lot more difficult now with quite a number of systems going to the cloud. Yet on the other side, the number of applications, the capacity that's generally needed is going up. So where is the balance over the next 10 years? Because if you're building a new data center, it's not something that's going to be around just for a few days or a few years. And I think that's the difficulty, that you could be under-provisioning by building a new data center because you may be running out of space, or you could be over-provisioning. And either way, it is an expense that you're actually carrying with you throughout the life of that data center. Perhaps by having a regional center, you're sort of hedging your bets a little bit, and by rationalizing and consolidating, perhaps that gives you a little bit more scope for this sort of variation that might come up. I guess also a lot of research systems are local, and latency is important with them. So there will perhaps be, for the foreseeable future, a need to run those in a more local, regional way and share those resources. But I think so far as mainstream IT is concerned, it's, I would defy anyone to say this is how my rack requirement is going to be over the next 10 years or 15 years. So for that reason, for standard, normal business IT, I think that pay-as-you-go and reduce the number of racks or increase them to suit demand is likely to be a more cost-effective option than building a huge data center. I'm sure others have seen this. I've seen huge data centers being built, and about 1/4 of it, or 1 bit of it is being used, and the rest of it is doing nothing, which is obviously a huge waste of money.
Okay, so is pay-as-you-go the way forward? Is cloud? We've heard a lot about cloud, but before we go on to our next question, I just want to bring Gift in, our student, because we're talking about, how do we manage our data? Where do we put it? Gift, does that matter? I mean, are you concerned about where we put our data?
As a student, on a serious note, we just want to be able to assess the resources as and when we want to. Whether you decide to store it locally or decide to outsource, it doesn't really matter too much to the student. They just want the services that are being offered to be available as and when required.
Okay, I think we kind of knew that. But we've heard a lot today about cloud computing, and I'm sure this will get the debate going as well. I'm going to invite Nigel Rata from Royal Holloway to ask us a question around cloud, and it might mean on funding. Nigel.
Hi there. So do current funding models challenge the adoption of cloud services, the relationship between CapEx, which we're all quite used to receiving, and you commented on around that's how research funding sort of comes in, versus the more needed OpEx model for subscription-based services?
Thomas, do you want to pick that one up first then?
Yeah, from a research perspective, the cloud seems to be a lot more risky, actually. So if I'm a researcher and I put in the research proposal, I want some compute on it, then the naughty way to do things is to cost in a server. And you buy that server with a warranty for a set number of years, and you have that compute for the duration of the project. And that's a sort of an understood thing, and it's capital expenditure, so that's fine. It's easy, in fact, because it pays down with the research councils. And there's an easy process to get access to that and everything else. And I think with cloud, if you were just to put it down as Amazon tokens, for example, on your application, then you actually run into issues. So I know about this one case where somebody had applied, had actually done that on a grant application, and had asked for a load of Amazon tokens as part of the project, and actually was criticised by reviewers at the application stage because they were asking for Amazon tokens, and it's very difficult to relate that to what that actually means in terms of content requirements. And so I think it's extremely difficult to move to that model. And I guess the other thing from a researcher perspective is that when you buy your compute, so I mean when you put your application to research council, quite often the research that you're doing will be, you've got the research program you've got the research council doing, that will also be the research you're undertaking. And now if the research council just say, well, we're just going to pay for what you need for that project, then you're going to have to get your compute somewhere else. And again, you go back to university, a university's going to put their hand in their pocket each time you want to spin up an instance of Amazon. The answer is probably no. So I suspect that for a lot of researchers, cloud's going to remain an unpopular way of going, simply because you have to get some sort of budget to be able to pay for it. Whereas we've got servers at Cardiff where researchers have bought them 5-6 years ago. They're probably going to fall over at some point soon. But effectively, the researcher will carry on using them because they're free.
Come back. So that's really interesting to hear that officially, around getting funding, researchers don't like cloud because it's risky. But what we know and what we're being told at these conferences and many others is there's all this shadow IT going on where effectively researchers are just getting credit cards and going off to the cloud and doing it because IT can't be responsive enough. So it's really interesting to... Absolutely. Closet IT, yeah.
That's the majority.
Yeah.
If you go to most universities in the country, I know various horrible cases of collaborators and colleagues who store their research data in USB hard disks in a closet, and that's their data storage for their large amounts of research data. And there's all sorts. As soon as you start scratching the surface, you'll find a multitude of other stories about how not to do it. Then that's what people are doing because the money comes in and they don't want to spend the money on hardware or storing it in a safe way when they could be doing that with
Paula, yeah.
There's two questions, or there's two issues I really want to pick up there. Yes, moving to a cloud funding model takes you from CapEx to OpEx. So my world is now revenue funding. I get very little capital funding because absolutely everything I do is based on a revenue budget. So we've just signed for a new contract on a data center. We won't own any servers, and that includes the researchers. Okay? The research element is done as pay as you go, and yet there will present some problems to them when they're doing a bid. But hopefully we've got some price models so the clarity is there, so they know what they're bidding for. So we've got different size servers they can call off on demand, pay a month, pay 12 months for that thing. So that will give the clarity. But absolutely, my entire budget now is based on revenue, and it means that there's two good things. Well, there's one good thing about it. It means that the university can never choose to opt out of funding it. So every year you probably go cap in hand asking for a bit of capital money to buy another server because it's just about to fall over. I don't have to do that now. I have a revenue budget, and I say if you pull the plug on that, you get no servers. So they have to keep funding me. The downside is they look at my revenue budget and want to get a 10% cut, and I can't cut that bit because it's fixed. It's a contract, it's a certain number of years. So what can be cut? Well, that's staff. Okay, so there's a plus. I get a continuous investment, a continuous refresh. At the end of 5 years, it's refreshed. Downside, something else has to save money. But this shadow IT malarkey going on here, it's delusional. Okay, you have to properly invest in research if you're going to look after the research. We've tried to find a commercial model that says, this is our core basic run state, but so researchers can call off, as I say, on a month-to-month basis, and therefore they can justify that to provide a funding model. But I think we have to find other solutions rather than squeezing a little bit of a little bit of capacity out of an ancient server that sits in the corner. Because I guarantee you, the point where that server falls over into the point you've realised that that research project went exponential and had goodness knows how much funding attached and risk attached to it. But nobody ever considered it because it was sitting in the corner, quietly, out of sight, out of mind. We've seen projects go from just incubator to really significant projects at the university. And the university, about time, should stomp up and recognise that, instead of asking researchers to work off the back of a fag packet, which is what you're saying.
I wouldn't overestimate the obvious benefit is if you put in a client location and the server, so you're always making sure somebody's being paid cost because you're away from the rules. And then what you'll do is it comes in, you give the quote, which I've seen a lot of people take the quote off the website, so it's 20% more than you actually pay for the server. And then whatever the money's in the account is then usable for anything. So there is an incentive. So the system incentivizes researchers to go down the shadow IT route. The whole system incentivizes it. And the thing is that when you're a researcher and you're trying to do your research with as cost effectively as possible, they're extremely good at being very cost effective. They're not necessarily great when it comes to managing risk in IT systems, but they are extremely good at doing things in a very cost effective way. And so actually, they will minimise their costs to be incredibly effective. At the moment, the system is waiting towards that, which is a real problem.
Well, before I go to Chris on the panel, who I know wants to come in, I want to invite some comments from the floor. So is it shadow IT, closet IT? Are you seeing an increase in your revenue budgets to offset, running down your capital expenditure, or have you got servers creaking in the bottom of your data center somewhere, still on a research grant somewhere? Comments from the floor.
The only thing I was going to say about the research compute side is that the thing that we found work is you give away the computers for free to the researchers. You do not charge them. Because if you charge them, they'll buy crap and put it in a cupboard.
Buying crap in a cupboard.
Just a comment on that. It's a fascinating conversation, so thank you for being quite honest and open about it. But actually, do you not think the funding models are going to change fairly rapidly over the next few years around the infrastructure you need to be able to even apply for grants? My background is not in higher education or in research, but I'm seeing a change in the way that people are actually approaching the grants these days. And some of the things you said are recognised, but there are changes now where we're having some real successful academics and getting the boxes from out of the cupboards and actually providing an environment where they can host them sensibly and safely and effectively.
So it depends, because the system is standard on peer review, and the panels by definition are not composed from the standard IT side. It goes through peer review and the data management panels are right, and that's fine. And it will go to the panel, and I've seen grants with frankly terrible data management plans be funded because they're good science, and good science trumps everything. And that's the problem, is that at the moment there's no within the way the research councils do their funding, there's no real calculation taken into account, mostly because the senior academics who sit on things like running the panels aren't competent or for the most part aren't competent. No, it's because they're not IT professionals. They can't sit down and look at a graph and say, all right, yeah, well they've not assessed the security risk properly, because they've not been trained to do that. So it's perfectly fair to say that the majority of academics who sit on the panel, they're a wet lab scientist interested in technology. They're not going to know about information security. They're not going to know about resilience of systems. They're not going to understand that aspect. And so the chances are they're not going to comment on it because they're focused on the science.
And I think that's where we as a society, as a group, should be supporting those grants and being allowed into those debates to add the value to that. And I think our institutions that are heavily research driven, perhaps it's about time we provided the infrastructure either in the cloud way or on premise if that's the choice, but so that we don't have to have that biting or fighting for the scraps from the table in terms of the consumables budget. And that's certainly when at Liverpool, with the collaboration between different disciplines, to be able to provide an environment for them is actually having some success because they don't have to worry about that side of it.
When you look at the scale of a lot of this stuff within universities and the sort of the surcharge that you have to put onto a research grant to provide certain amounts of storage over 5 years, the costs, when you've got a £500,000 grant, a couple of £1,000 quite effectively as an extra line on the grant for to provide IT infrastructure, and then a guarantee to researchers to then have whatever they need in terms of the infrastructure. Probably all that's necessary, and actually, it could work really, really well. The problem is that we need the common sense at the level of the management, and we need trust between IT departments and researchers, which in a lot of places isn't there because people don't trust each other. And the moment that somebody says something to an IT, the first thing that comes out is we want this amount of money. It's usually quite a large number, which seems intrinsically unreasonable. And the thing is that the other aspect to it is that, certainly from an academic perspective, if I fill in my financial form and I'm filling in a grant, if there's a line on there that I don't have an option on, okay, so if the university puts in its overheads, I don't that's non-negotiable. I can't argue with that. Because if there was a line for IT infrastructure, which is becoming central to most scientific projects in the life sciences and physical sciences nowadays, if there was a standard line, a standard chart, which was then ring-fenced and went towards providing core IT infrastructure, whether it's cloud or whatever associated with the project, then at that point you've got around the problem. But we're not doing that, and I don't know why.
Okay, some more comments from the floor. We've got one here.
Well, perhaps one of the services that IT should be providing to you is helping to write the bit of the grant that stores the money, rather than simply levying the charge on you. Because I'm very taken with what you said about the domain competency of the people reviewing the application. Why would anybody expect the applicant to have a domain competency to design their IT as well? That's crazy. If they're wet lab scientists, why are they writing the IT section?
It is crazy. I mean, actually, so because I sit in the boardroom in the IT and the research world, I deal with a lot of researchers who want help to write their data management plans at Cardiff. So we have, and we're actually developing now with IT services a sort of standard, sort of semi-standard outline for data management plans, which actually articulates this. But then we need to work out the funding model that's chargeable to actually get that possible. But it's a slow process. And it's a process that, again, within the institution, it's hard to get people excited about. It's unfortunately, not very exciting. And because the priority in terms of funding is so low on the data management, it has to look all right. As long as it looks sensible, then it's not going to get called. That's the problem.
So we've got a comment over there.
Hi there. I'm just going to step back and to Paula for an experience question more than anything. In your model of moving to revenue budgets, which is a conversation I've had with my FD for about 6 months and finally turned a corner, are you seeing an increase in sprawl of activity, if just provisioning servers, and have you suffered any bill shocks? So where revenue has taken a spike, as we used to have in the old mobile phone world.
So, Paula, the question was, are you seeing any shocks in funding from a revenue model? Do you get spikes where there's a period where you've got to over-deliver?
No, not at the moment. So let me just explain my method. At the moment, our model, we've just signed this contract that will take me into this new world of not owning any hardware. But the model I operate today, I have bought a certain amount of compute that's nicely aged, and we try and cram everything that we possibly can in there. And we're putting our hand up to those people who ask us for a little bit more, and they say, really sorry, can't help you out here. In the new model, I'll be able to say, of course I can help you out, here's the price for that, and I will then be saying to them, right, we need to make a business case for this. Let's get that funding. Currently, the university operates a model on everything else, like telephones and desktops, where I own all the costs. I pay every phone bill, regardless of how stupid it is. I pay for every laptop, no matter how big they need it. So I can see a world for me, in my institution, where I don't do that chargeback. I just find a way of presenting to the university reasonable costs incurred that cover that spike this year. We might agree a quota with each school that says, we'll provision this, and I get permission from the university to provision to that particular spike, and that's where I think it's going to go. But potentially, in my model, I would get spiky costs, but I'm hoping that actually I'll get the kickback from the revenue from the research project, which at the present I don't. So at the moment, I just get all of the costs and none of the gain. I'm hoping I'll get a little bit of money going forward.
Okay, Chris, I know you've been itching to join the debate.
Yeah, I just want to take a step back for a moment. We're talking about cloud as if it's a specific thing, and is it good or is it bad? But I think it's important to understand that there are different types of cloud, different platforms as a service that I think we're largely talking about. But there's a huge raft of software as a service applications that can be sourced in different ways. So it's a very, very broad subject. Also, within a university, there are business systems and services. There are requirements to support students and teaching and learning. and then there are the requirements of the research community, and they're rather different. So I think we're sort of being asked to say, is cloud good or bad, but in reality it's a complex matrix to address. But very quickly, my second point is something that I'm very passionate about, and that is that as an IT community, we have to work very, very closely with the business. There was discussion about is cloud beneficial in terms of one business metric, so absolute costs and whether it's CapEx or OpEx. But there are many, many other business considerations, such as flexibility, scalability, agility, security, risk, as well as cost models, finance models. And it's an absolutely key area where IT and the business needs to work together to make sure jointly the right decision is made for the institution.
Okay. I'm going to take one more comment on this topic from the floor, and then we'll move on to explore some of those issues. Well, maybe two comments. Got one over here first, please.
My comment is mainly around the cost of moving to the cloud in the first place. Most universities have already invested in money to provision their data center. They already have their computers or servers, and they put them in the data center and that are used. So how do you estimate how much it will cost from moving from that to the cloud? Most cloud providers, in terms of providing services or servers and things, charge on bandwidth, how much compute is used. Those are normal things that most data centers or infrastructure team don't look at. And unless the server is running to a halt, they won't look at how much a single application is taking up. So how do you know how much the cloud costs at the starting point, not going forward, but moving into it in the first place?
I think that's a good question. I'm going to throw this one back at you all, because earlier none of you put your hands up and said you knew how much your data centers cost. So even if you knew what the cloud cost, what were you comparing it against? Any thoughts? Comment from over there.
So I'm ignoring that question and going back to the previous one.
Nicely done.
I think one of the problems with getting accurate estimates of your IT and system costs as a researcher in a proposal, my own experience in speaking to other people at universities, is generally at a university, when you put your proposal together, you've probably got 2 or 3 on the go, you're working to deadlines, and typically you're required by the university to do a financial check of what you submit, but that's purely general, almost invariably just staff costs and the overheads, etc., etc. It's not to check on the IT systems. So I think what you need to do is to get the processes of the university to require that, and I think the hook into that is the research data management. So if their check can be forced to be added for that, and you can encourage the university to adopt that policy, then that's a hook at which you can say, oh, and also to check the other IT aspects. I think that would be an opening. And the challenge with that is doing it in a timely way. Again, researchers, when they're putting in proposals, tend to not necessarily leave it to the last minute, but quite late. The finance check can take a couple of days. The challenge for the computing services is, can you actually analyse the proposal and give a decent estimate in a couple of days? And that's your challenge, to actually get researchers on side.
Okay, so some interesting debate there around revenue, CapEx, funding, meeting researchers' demands, COVID IT. But as we move into this new model, which is going to be cloud-based, whether that's infrastructure, platform, or software as a service, I think one of the key things that keeps coming up will be borne out by our next question. And Matt, I believe you've got a question for us.
I have, yes. With more and more data services being moved to the cloud, how confident are you around kind of the security aspect, and also about where the data is held, where it actually resides?
I'm going to throw this one actually. Gift, I'm going to ask you to come in here. Do you care how we look after your data? Are you sure?
Obviously, if sensitive information has to be stored securely, you don't want to be storing things safe. Because eventually, student details need to be protected, and all these things just need to be checked. We don't really care how it's done, but it's worth considering that where you're storing this data, is it safe or is it easy to get back if you need to, and need to make this secure and short-based?
So let me be a little bit difficult here and ask you, how do you know, and we'll use your university as an example, Wolverhampton, how do you know that they are storing your data safely?
Well, I'm not the student who actually use the terms. I didn't really know that, but I do know because I did work very shortly with the IT services, only for about a week because I did a different placement. I worked with them, and during that time, I did notice the way they treated backups and all that information from the students. Most students, I suspect, we don't really know exactly how the data is used and how it's being used. And I think it's probably a thing of awareness, trying to get the students to be more aware of the services that the university offers and how they can use them and how the university manages this information. I think it's just it's an issue of concern for the students, and not a lot of students have that.
Okay, well, I'm going to bring in, before I throw this open to the rest of the panel, we had an anonymous question come from the floor, which is related to this. It's around the sort of perception from the supplier base that institutions are nervous around data protection, and therefore that's one of the barriers, if you like, to moving into this new world. So with security in mind, Mac's question, how confident are you with security and where data is being held? Paula?
Most of my life right now is taken up by writing contracts. Okay? I don't believe it's in a procurement. The university's procurement officers. I do. Why do I do it? Because I care. I care where the data is. I care that it's in a UK or a European data centre, and if it's not, that it's protected by what's it called? Thank you, safe harbour. I care about exit management. I want to make sure that's in there. I care about when I'm selecting a supplier that they've got the right accreditations. I care about having backups and testing those backups and having VR arrangements and testing those VR arrangements. So I put a lot of effort into making sure that the sorts of things that I could have as clauses and arrangements are there, and liabilities and all the rest of it to protect me. Now you might say, well, still, how do you know? Well, there's no pen testing that you would expect a supplier to do regularly. But I'd also throw the question back the other way. How do you know that your services on your campuses are secure? What extra protections do you have about people accessing them? Because genuinely, I think a lot of our data in our data centre is better protected than anything that we do on campus. We get brownouts all the time. We get, well, not all. Well, at least twice a year we'll have a brownout. You know, how do I know which researcher's tucked what under his desk and under what circumstance? And so, genuinely, I think we're being a bit precious here. I think you're ascribing to the supplier a whole load of assumptions that actually I think they're better positioned to defend than we are ourselves about the way we look after our own data centres and data. So I don't see a problem, but I do see an obligation that the IT department must be really active in selecting a supplier and make sure that they look for all of the necessary clauses and protections in the contracts that they strike, and service operational procedures that they then agree to undertake. So I don't see the problem, but you do have to do a lot of work to make sure that it works for you.
Okay, so here's a couple of questions for the floor then. A show of hands. How many of you can guarantee that your data is safe and secure? Anyone? Oh, one, two, perhaps two hands.
How do you know that?
Well, there we are. Steve, do you want to wait for a microphone?
Well, I mean, by design, this has got to be one of the fundamental things that you do, I would suggest there. We concentrate on this enormously. There would be no circumstances, I think, that you would not expect to get some data incident at some point, but it's how you recover from it. And it's the same thing I would suggest there. We've seen outages with all sorts of massive companies where data has been lost. Touch wood, we've never had anything like that at all. We've got proper backup regimes in there, multiple redundancy. There's a limit to what you can do. I would suggest that in most university IT sections, people take this very, very seriously. You don't hear of it much, and for me, the absence of incidents gives me confidence in there. So I would suggest that we do know what's going on. We spend a lot of time spending money on configuring firewalls, sticking in policies, concentrating on information security policies to educate users. And I suggest there that probably we've got more of a challenge than a lot of cloud providers because of the breadth of the services we have to provide. When we've been working with the procurement for the Northern Datacenter, SDC2, one of the big things we learned from the one SDC1 is that the co-location people have no experience whatsoever of managing HPC computing and 20 kilowatt racks and all the rest of it. So we were ahead of the game there. I understand that there might be, occasions there where you might find performance not so good, but I don't think that is one of the problems that we've got in IT sections in universities, personally.
Okay, Chris, can the sector manage our data safely, or can the suppliers do it better for us?
Well, I think it's very difficult to say. I think, first of all, as with cloud, we say the security, but security is multifaceted. It's security for your overall infrastructure. What happens if you have a denial of service attack and you have no IT services? There's also protection of information in transit, privileging service. And then there's security around data at rest, so making sure that you have backups, but also make sure that even authorised users are not changing data when they're not allowed to. So there are multiple facets. What I would say, once again, sort of look into other areas where Cisco does business, there is very different standards and best practices that people have to adhere to, whereas I think probably across the university sector, there are a common set of standards. Obviously, the government is administered by CSG in Cheltenham, and the standards for healthcare and so on and so forth. Maybe there aren't quite the same body of standards. But I think that like lots of these things, it's a question of breaking it down, analysing the different aspects of security, identifying the risks, and I would say take the advice of industry, not only Cisco, but many other providers, and it's all about monitoring and understanding, particularly when there's a zero-day attack that you haven't seen before, mitigating it and having techniques for remediating it. So you need to make sure that you've got a robust strategy, and I think industry in the broadest sense including Cisco can help that.
The other thing to add on to that is that in even say a zero-day situation where you potentially get a serious breach, you're not going to be protected against that having stuff out in a co-ed data center or managed by somebody else. You can be just as vulnerable as whether it's hosted in-house or not. And I think the other aspect to consider is reputation, right? So within the university, if something goes wrong and it's sort of run by Cardiff University IT, then most researchers it's sort of taken as read that things happen, IT services, sometimes stuff breaks, and it gets fixed. And normally they're quite good at communicating with it to find out what's going on. If you've got an external company that the university is paying to provide a service and it breaks, then there's a reputational, and you've seen it with various services or pieces of software or arrangements where that's happened. There's a reputational damage to that service which is being offered by the university, which will sometimes cause users not to trust that and to look at other ways of storing their data or managing their data or analysing their data. And so there is a reputational thing. And it's it's a paradox. It's a strange thing to think about because you think that it should be treated the same everywhere, but there is always a risk that actually if you have a serious outage with a service that you're paying for outside, it does undermine trust in that service amongst your users. And then if they can use an alternate service, they probably will.
Well, food for thought, and at a UCISA conference actually in March, we were told it's not a matter of if you have a security breach, it is just when it's going to happen. So I think, food for thought indeed. We've been talking a lot about cloud-based services, but I want to see where else this can go. So my next question comes from Arthur Clune from the University of York. Arthur.
We've talked quite a lot about data center outsourcing, but just looking at outsourcing more widely, which is not that well used in the sector. Some institutions do it for desktops, networks, but not many, whereas most companies will outsource their networking, plus their desktops, plus maybe even their support. So I'm wondering what you think, whether we'll see more of that, whether we'll see less of that.
Well, I know this is one for you. So the question was, outsourcing. Is there more scope for more outsourcing in the sector?
Yes, sadly. I say sadly because sometimes you feel like you're being whittled away by your institution. But yes, there is. We have a first-line IT support desk provided out of India. We have got a range of applications, like Moodle, income management, and others that are hosted through application as a service. We've got telephony third-line support hosted as a service. There's a range of things that we have got outsourced through providers, and including our aspiration to have desktop development. In terms of everybody pretty much uses a Microsoft desktop platform. I've got one PC expert. He is not necessarily, he cannot be the best person to design a future desktop. He can't know enough about those areas. So I see that what IT services should be focusing on are those things where you know a high amount of business knowledge and a high amount of technical knowledge, and that's where you should be positioning yourself. And the stuff that just requires high technical knowledge, that is something where I think we should be looking to suppliers to help you. Frankly, I don't see why. Sometimes it feels a little exhausting that the universities are pressing you to look at the next thing. But actually, the other thing that comes with it is agility. The more you can have somebody else support some of these more routine elements of your business, the more it frees up the staff that you have to do the interesting stuff, frankly. So it feels a little exhausting just because it's a never-ending train of justification, analysis, thinking outside the box. But actually what it really frees us up to do, ultimately, is be more agile, as long as you can continue to make the case for staffing and budget.
Thomas, should we be outsourcing more? Are you concerned about that?
I think it's horses for courses. I mean, when I see stuff like, so we've just moved over to Office 365 at Cardiff, and the response from everyone I know in the university has been overwhelmingly positive for the email system. And I think that's a classic example of where you take a well-defined use case and a service that the university can make quite a big saving on by moving out, and it's done that. And so I think it's one of those things where you look at what you're going to need, you try and anticipate the future, and then you pick the best value service for meeting those objectives. And I think that's the most sensible way to proceed.
I'm playing devil's advocate with this. I mean, if Cardiff was, and by the way, I don't know anything here, so please don't get alarmed, but if Cardiff was to sort of outsource its IT function in entirety, you had a third party coming along doing app-site desktop support, managing your corporate applications.
Knowing the range of users that are around, I mean, some of that stuff is not
figure.
It's a large diverse environment.
And we've seen some interesting cases in the commercial sector where there's been a huge swathe of outsourcing and then bringing back in again afterwards. Chris, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think my panelists are spot on. I think in other sectors, particularly, there have been those wholesale transformational IT outsources where all IT functions have been placed, and I've seen that particularly in local government, for example. But the tide has swung. There are all sorts of negatives around that. But as Paula says, strategic pieces of outsourcing, maybe some which look at software as a service contracts, are very, very beneficial because it's very, very difficult for IT departments with finite resources to run everything and do everything. So it's a question of assessing the business requirement and determining is it something that can be brought in either as a service or as expertise. So I would agree entirely with what Paul said.
Okay. I'm conscious we're getting towards the end of IQT. I want to make sure I've given anybody that's got a burning question an opportunity to ask it. So if there are some burning questions for our panelists, please raise your hand now. Well, that kind of suggests we're done. So on that basis, I'm finishing just a few minutes early for a change. I've beaten my last record with it. I should like to thank you, the audience, our panelists, Paula Vickers, Gift Ozonuwe, Chris Blenkhorn, and Thomas Connor. So thank you very much indeed, panelists.